A little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Kristen. Hello, everyone. Really honored and excited to be here. My name is Raja Bhattar. I use they, them pronouns, and I am currently on Tongva land in Los Angeles. I'm really just excited to be part of the leadership family and be with the conversation today.
Well, today we're going to be talking about breaking and broadening the binary, right? And expanding our gender identity, expression, and queerness in our work. I'm really excited to engage in this conversation with you all, and to be led by Raja, and to just to learn together as we have this opportunity. Before we get started, I want to just acknowledge where we're at. And by reading our land acknowledgement. So LeaderShape, we like to begin every time we gather together by acknowledging that the land that each of us is on today is the original homelands of indigenous and tribal nations. And we do acknowledge the painful history and genocide and forced removal from these territories. And we honor and respect that many diverse indigenous peoples are still connected to this land. We ask that you please honor and acknowledge the native and indigenous peoples from the land that you are joining us from, and give that thought to your ancestry and the generations that have come before you.
All right. And so I think that's a great segue, Kristen. If you can, maybe if you know what land you are on and what occupied land you're, if you can just share that in the chat box. I think it's important. If you don't know, that's a good chance to at least write that down as a follow-up to just Google yourself for yourself later, and to be able to learn the history of where you are and where your family has come from. I just wanted to acknowledge the present moment. And I think this is come from a Buddhist tradition. It's really about like, this is it, right? This is the moment. This is the time. So if you can just maybe join me in a deep breath. And as you breathe in, just really take in all the things that we are holding on to, whether it's the Zooming, the pandemics that are happening across the world, the various responsibilities and roles that we've been thrown into. And so just really hold that in. And as you exhale, really honor the ability to be alive in this moment, that even in the worst moment, that these are the moments we get to be alive for, to actually get to do something, and we have the agency to do that. And so I think for me that that's what gets me up every morning, is know that every time I wake up, I have another chance to do something about the things that I believe need to shift, as Angela Davis says, and really be grateful for the things that already exist. But really, from the BLM movement and the racial justice movement that are happening, to the anti-Asian violence that's happening, to the pandemic that's happening in the US, to the colonialism, the racism, the sexism, the homophobia, the transphobia, the ableism, the ethnocentrism. Just there's a lot happening. And in that moment, I think the work that we do is important. So I just wanted to kind of name all that. And so thank you all for joining in that process. Great. Thank you. Next slide.
Yeah, next one. So really, to go along with that, I think in what Raja's framed, just in our time and space, this is important for us at LeaderShape, because our mission as a not-for-profit is really to transform the world by increasing the number of people who lead with integrity and have a healthy disregard for the impossible. And a lot of that is engaging in conversations that matter, whether they are topics that we are knowledgeable about or topics that we're learning about, right? Is how are we change agents in the world that we live in to make this world a more just, caring, and thriving place. And that's all the work that we're doing. And so we're excited to have you all join us in that community of doing the work. And that really does frame for us the time that we have together. So with that framing, Raja, I'm going to turn it over to you. I know that, or actually, I'm going to ask some polling questions. I forgot. We have some polling questions. We want to know a little bit about who's here in the room. When you get to gather together in person, we get to find these things out just by the conversations that we have with each other, because we're sitting next to each other at a conference room or a convention center. And so we want to have a little bit of that here. So we have some polling questions that we're going to put up to find out who's with us today. So first question, want to know a little bit and answer this question. I feel comfortable and knowledgeable with my understanding of gender identity, expression, and fluidity. So very, somewhat, or not at all. Awesome. Looks like those responses are still coming in. We've almost all voted. Great. So it looks like we are very and somewhat comfortable and knowledgeable with our understanding. Wonderful. I think that gives us a good framing. I don't know what you think, Raja, about the conversation and where we're going today.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, we have another poll question that will pop up for you all. So in this question, we would like to know, I have student leaders who don't identify with traditional masculine, feminine, or man or women identities. Yes, no, or I'm not sure. Recognizing we work with students with a diverse experience, right, in their in who they are and how they identify. Okay. I think everybody has voted.
Great.
We'll show the results there, and it looks like most people do.
And I would just add that even if you don't think you have any folks that identify in a non-binary context, you probably do. We just don't know it. And so I think this is a bit of a trick question because I think we all have folks who I don't identify whether they're open about it or feel safe to talk about it. I think that's also part of the conversation today.
Absolutely, absolutely. So then our third poll question for today will pop up. I have skills and strategies to navigate an authentic relationship with gender non-binary student leaders. Very, somewhat, or not at all. I appreciate these questions. It's just gives us also an opportunity to do some of our own self-reflection, right? Of our comfort level and our work with students. It looks like I think we're going to end it. We have everybody has voted again, and it looks like we're kind of split here between very and somewhat. And hopefully, the conversations we have today increase our skills and strategies to navigate those relationships. And then the last poll question. I feel comfortable challenging cisgender and heteronormative statements, policies, and practices in my department or programs. Very, somewhat, or not at all. I feel like this question could be a topic of conversation all on its own.
Totally.
They're still responding. Okay. Looks like again, right? We're here with very and somewhat, and then we have a couple folks are not at all comfortable in that, and hopefully we'll be able to engage in that conversation as well, right? And how do we increase our comfort level and our ability to have those conversations and to challenge those statements and policies and practices.
Yeah, I think this is the it's hard to figure out when and how to be an agent for change. And I think part of the conversation is just recognizing that we may be uncomfortable because that's the a key part of the learning process is recognize when and how we react or not and how we go through that's it's a whole nother workshop. But yeah,
Wonderful. Well, with
awesome.
that, Raja, I'm going to turn it over to you. I know you have some things to share, and we'll continue to talk together, and hopefully, too, if people have questions, I know you want them to put those in the chat, and well, let's begin.
Yeah, thank you, Kristen, and thank you, Vernon. I'm really excited to be here. For folks that are engaging, feel free to add questions, thought, feelings into the chat box. I will try to keep my eye on that as well. And I hope this is more of a conversation than a lecture. Um, so I think for me, just four things that I always think about when we enter particularly conversations around identity and particularly around gender queerness. It's just the fact that gender doesn't exist in its own kind of vacuum. It's also intersected and impacted by various other identities. And so the idea of intersectionality, both from Kimberly Crenshaw, kind of a legal perspective, but also just in the intersectional experience of identities and the ways that as a genderqueer person, I don't show up just as a genderqueer person, right? It's that I am impacted by my race, by my class, by my education, by my immigrant status, and all those things. And so, often I have to. I often feel like I have to, in some ways, work harder, right, and to kind of name the genderqueerness within different spaces because I'm not seen as blank enough, and so that often impacts and and just figure out kind of what that would have been like for me as a college student. I think so. I didn't just think about how that might impact our leadership programs and how much energy it requires us as leaders and facilitators and campus leaders to really be intentional about the work that we do, which I think for me goes to the intent versus impact. The intent might be, I want to be inclusive for everyone, or I don't want to cause harm, or I don't want to cause discomfort, and yet recognizing that for a lot of us who are genderqueer, we often have to go through that level of discomfort every day simply to exist. And so the impact is often when we say, well, I had an experience a couple of months ago where I was like, oh, I was, or I guess almost a year ago now, where I was like, is there a gender inclusive restroom close by to this event that's happening? They're like, well, it's about 5 blocks away, but it's just too hard for us to make one in the building. And I was like, so you're bringing me as a speaker, but you tell me it's too hard for you to accommodate me. So what are you actually wanting from me to be there for? And
Right.
so the intent was, oh, it's just too much paperwork for us. But what does that mean to then in that process deny my existence and deny simply a basic sense of safety, which is the next one. And
Right.
so I think for me, gender queerness and really being intentional about asking, I think for me, two key questions: why are we doing this, and whose perspective is not at the table? I think often gets us to think about the safety of, okay, if we think we don't have any genderqueer students in the campus or in our program, why is that? And is that actually true? Right? Or is that something just an assumption because we don't see
Right.
someone's identity as being queer enough to exist? And I remember, I was the director of the LGBT Center at UCLA for about 7 years, and I remember as I was coming out in my own gender queerness, I would actually have these moments where I felt like I had a colleague say, well, if you just wore longer earrings regularly, that would just help me remember that you're genderqueer. And so I feel like I had to qualify and meet some standard for them, and to which then made me feel unsafe with someone that was actually a campus partner that I had to work with on a daily basis. And so then really recognizing and kind of challenging our own isms and kind of projections on this work. And I do this too. So this is also not to say like I figured it out. Like we all have our shit to work through. But what the goal is to build safety, but also even more so, thinking about safe enough to be able to engage in the conversations, but brave enough to leave with a different perspective and actually think about what that means for us. And then context, thinking about in the US currently, we're at a different level to be able to have this conversation than students who may be international students and who are coming from different identities and experiences. And so both having the compassion to understand and recognize that people are coming from different backgrounds and understanding. And often in the work that I do, I say the goal is progress, not perfection. And so can we help everyone both be aware of kind of where they are, which is I think where the polling questions come in, just to be able to do that self-reflection. And then also then think about like, how do we move them forward a little bit towards something that is about equity and inclusion on our campus, which then is around fostering a belonging, which is really about, and what agency do we have, and really being clear about what context do I have control over, and how can I be a change agent in that specific space versus feeling like I can't change the policy on campus, so I don't have to do anything. So really letting go of that responsibility for that. I also talk really fast when I talk about this stuff. So if you need me to slow down, please raise your hand or say something or put something in the text box. So just because this is something I talk about all day, and this is something that's really close to my heart. So I will not take it personally if you say, please slow down.
And you can use the reaction button if you've updated Zoom. I don't have it updated on my computer, but I know sometimes if you've updated to the latest Zoom, you can do the little slow down as a reaction, and we'll be able to see that as well
Wow.
on your screens. But what I appreciate about what you're saying, Raja, is that just the process of it, right? Is that there isn't this isn't like you do one thing and that's the answer, right? We're looking at the entirety of your lived experience, of anyone's lived experience, and how that is layered with all of the different pieces that you've mentioned, and still respecting the humanity in each of us, right? And recognizing at our core what do we all deserve, and how do we get to that?
Right. And I think there's a piece between recognizing the humanity and then allowing that to justify our inability to act. And so I think like, well, I'm so sorry I said that to you, but then say it again, right? Or like I had a former supervisor who was the chief diversity officer for the campus who would continue to misgender me, even though that's the only pronouns that she's known for me. And for me, it was like, okay, at some point, even though you have other marginal identities, you still have to take responsibility for what, so I can have compassion for you the
Right.
first couple of times because I'm like, I know we're all learning and we make mistakes. And at the same time, what does that mean to actually do that self-reflection work, right?
Absolutely.
Um, and so I just put on a couple of strategies. I actually had like 3 pages of notes, but I was like, that's a little too much, and that's a whole nother workshop. And to talk about kind of where, and how do we show up as agents of change? Where and how do we stay silent? What does that mean? And how do we understand our own agency, et cetera? So it's a whole other conversation. But I think really the why and how, again, as I said earlier, um, the why, when we're thinking about a leadership application form, we often ask about gender when we actually probably mean sex, and often trying to figure out what's the purpose of asking this question. Like, is that even important? And if so, can we just leave it open so that people get to fill it out with their own self-identity, so we're not forcing them to do a binary experience. I just filled out a form yesterday for a campus where it's like those are the only two options. I had to answer it to be able to go into to actually get paid by the campus. And but it was, again, just reminding me that like I'm in a world that is built in a binary structure and that I'm quote unquote not enough. And so just that, then the intent was they needed this information for whatever legal representation. And yet for me, it felt like it was that continued really macro aggression, and at a structural level. And this is where the intersectionality comes in, right? It's the individual, interpersonal, institutional level that we have all these different systems that are set up for us. And so really asking, why do we need this? Why is this here? Why does it exist? When we think about restrooms, rather than saying the women's room and the men's room, can we just say restrooms? Can we just actually create single stall restrooms? And who gets to decide that, right? I remember at a previous campus, we were building a new conference center. And from the beginning, I was like, can you make sure there's gender inclusive restrooms? Or can you just make all of them single stall restrooms? They're like, oh, we'll think about it. We'll think about it. And then they open brand new state of the art conference center without any gender inclusive restrooms. And so then the conference coordinator came to said, you know, and he was a white gay man. He was like, I am a white gay man, so I want to support my community. I want to give you special rates to do program. And I was like, I refuse to do so, because I was like, I've been telling y'all for 4 years that this is not going to be inclusive, and I'm not going to force genderqueer students to come in and be like, in a brand new building, they have to go to another building around the corner simply to feel valued and so that they can pee. Like, that's just not okay. And so also being able to like figure out why and how, how are we where are we utilizing our services, and who are we actually prioritizing in this work. And then also just in the data collection pieces and thinking about, when we collect data on our campuses, are we actually collecting gender inclusive data? Are we actually utilizing that as we make decisions about our programs, particularly around leadership? And what does it actually mean for us? And what are the practices when we think about, when we talk about our models for leadership? Why do we use that particular model? And who was it developed on? And whose perspectives are actually there? Because often I would say they're very male and masculine centric and white centric ideas of leadership. And so even just asking why do we use that? Like, what other models of leadership can we utilize, and that, and think about what does it mean that we, as a quote unquote most progressive and richest country in the world, have still not been able to have a female president, because it's either you're too much or too little. And so there's always this too much, too little, something that I have to go do on a daily basis. And so often, how do we create systems, and what are the systems that are already in place that we are perpetuating even without actually asking the why and the how? And so really, I would say that those are, if nothing else from this discussion, is to say that often just asking the why are we doing this, and then how is this maybe impacting positively or negatively the communities that we want to serve. And then also knowing that even if you don't think that there's any genderqueer students or gender nonconforming students, they're there. It might be the structures allow them to either feel uncomfortable sharing with you, or that the system just is not there to even collect it, so they're forced into a binary because the system just doesn't allow it. And so how do we, what does that look like? And really utilizing the power of our organization. So I remember when we used to put on our lavender graduation, we would do it at the business school. They're like, well, we don't have gender inclusive restrooms. So I was like, well, we're going to then convert one into a gender inclusive restroom, because we're paying you the money to do this. And so that's been part of our writers, that that contract has to be. And they were like, it took a while to do it, but then once we were able to do it, then we had set the precedent. And said, well, we did it in this building, why won't you do this? Or like, we've done it last year. And so it also allows us to be agents of change. And that's how you change the culture, is through those individual actions. And then I think an easy thing that most of us are probably pretty familiar with at this point is just think about pronouns, which feels at this point a little basic, but I think it's still something that people struggle with, thinking about even just in our Zoom windows, having the pronouns, and I still get misgendered, right? I'm like, it's right freaking there. You don't have to,
You
you
can
don't
read
have
it right by my
to
name, right there.
exactly. But allows us to be able to also not make assumptions on who is on the other side and what they're. So like really utilizing that to say, especially, and especially appreciate it when cis heteronormative people do it, because I think it's like you don't have to. And so then doing that to normalize it for everyone makes it safer for me to do so. I remember a couple of years ago, I was invited to be a facilitator for a Greek leadership retreat. And I was like, oh God. And there was just a lot of fear, and my own kind of stuff came about
Or
being with, you know, uh, gendered organizations in a leadership retreat for 4 days in the middle of the mountains. I was like, and what I so appreciated was that the facilitator, when we did introductions, said everyone's going to go around and do pronouns and names, et cetera, and what organization you're with. And I was the only one that actually used any non-gender, non-binary pronouns. But the fact that everyone had to do it made me feel like I could do it without having to feel like I had to be the one odd person now. And so just even that, just making that a normal part of what we do. But what I also learned at an experience was not to force people to feel like they have to share a pronoun. Because
right.
a couple of years ago, I was in another campus role where I was speaking with graduate students. I was like, okay, well, let's go around and do names and pronouns. And one student actually really got emotional. I actually had to leave. And I was like, what's going on? I was, did I say something wrong? And they're like, well, this person hasn't really shared their pronouns with anyone in the space. So they felt like it almost felt like it was forced to do so.
Right.
And so also I was like, oh my God. So in trying to be inclusive, I also caused harm for someone. And so to really then actually recover and to say, if you feel comfortable, please share your pronouns so we can start to build and we can name you as you'd like to be named. So I think that caveat allows for people to, again, it's the progress, not perfection, right? Allows people to kind of recognize where we are and feel comfortable in that process. I also have my business cards have pronouns on them because I'm like, why not? I get to choose that. I get to really do that on my own and make sure that um, again, it's making it impossible for people to say, oh, I just didn't know your pronoun. I'm like, really? It's on my email. It's on my business card. It's in my Zoom window. It's on everything that I write. So like, clearly at that point, you're just not wanting to choose. And so then actually calling people in on that and engaging that. Also, name tags are pretty easy at this point. I think people do that. Applications, I've seen people say preferred name and also preferred pronouns. I also like preferred pronoun versus what's the other word? Or even just saying pronouns versus
Right.
preferred pronouns.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was, yeah, because I'm like, that's like, it's not just preferred, these are my pronouns. And
Right.
so I actually want, like, it's not like I have a preferred sexuality or a preferred racial identity. It is who I am. And so just saying pronouns versus preferred pronouns or preferred gender pronouns. Or I've also heard it saying personal gender pronouns. Like, oh, I like that. So that could be the PGP that people use.
I like that one. I like that. I haven't heard that one, but I know we've talked about that a lot at LeaderShape too. Like it just is who I am. So I want that. It is my pronoun, right? And I think too, when I think about pronouns, it makes me think about how we're preparing students once they graduate and
Right.
how that transforms culture. So when they go into the workplace, we've already engaged in these conversations in their college environment, and then they are taking that into their business or wherever they go after graduation into that environment as well, which we know can be additionally challenging, but it is giving them practice in creating these environments where we are asking people, who are you and how can I show that I value you?
Yeah. And I see Christine's note. I really appreciate just even the training. What are your parameters? Like, what can I use to address you? So really taking the agency and how do I name you in your authentic self? I appreciate that. Yeah, I think so. I mean, this is where it's the waves of change, right? It's like we start with our students because we know that those are going to be the leaders of tomorrow in the world, and so that's how we create cultural change. And then just binary language, rather than saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our leadership retreat," or I remember having a conversation with our Greek life staff a couple of years ago at one of my former campuses, and they realized like when they send out on the dean's office, when they send out conduct letters, they say, "Dear Miss or Mrs. Kristen Young or Dr." And I was like, "Oh, that's interesting." And I was like, "Well," they're like, "What do we do?" And I was like, "Why don't you just say, Dear Kristen Young?"
Right.
It's
Right.
still formal. It's not just dear Kristen or dear whatever Young, right? But dear, just use the whole name. And so, like, really think about why do we use this language? I always joke around like I got a doctor, so I don't have to deal with a Mr. or Mrs. Like, just call me doctor.
It
Because
works.
it
It
is
also
the
works.
best gender inclusive prefix you can use for me. Um, but again, just like honoring the fact that we have so much, and even like I see the number of examples that say he or she, da 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 da, and I'm like, why? Why can't you just say they? Because that's something that is actually a part of our language that's been around since like the 17, like actually like 1300s, and yet we still feel like there's a need to fit into the binary.
Right.
And I see, Riley, a mixture is something that I've seen used. It just doesn't seem as popular or common vernacular for folks. I think in progressive spaces and particularly within LGBTQ centers, people are using them. I haven't seen that really being used at a much broader level. And I think just often some people have said, is that just a typo? I'm like, no, it's actually intentional. So if you're able to do that, then do it, but also have some type of definition or explanation so people know what's happening there. Um, yeah, and so I always say, hey y'all, what's going on? Hey people, hey folks. And I hate hey guys. That's a whole nother sexist, genderist system, but that's a whole nother conversation. I always say, until it's comfortable for me to go into a room full of mixed gender people and say, hey girls, without it being seen as offensive or giggly, I'm
Right.
not gonna say hey guys, because it's just not helpful. And then really representation matters. Like this is the best way to really, I can tell you all the things that to do, but like on your own campus, like ask your folks on campus, because there are genderqueer folks in your programs. And so ask the gender, trans, gender nonconforming and non-binary folks on campus, like, hey, we want to be more intentional about how we foster belonging and support in our programs. Would you be interested in sharing some perspectives with us, right? And also find ways to honor their labor. And it's not just taking from it, but actually you're also then saying, and can we maybe offer you a program on leadership that like there create some barter system as well so that you can actually engage in that conversation. And then this is a super silly but like basic way. It's like hire people, like gender nonconforming people. If you hire them, I remember when I was at UCLA, we were like, we need to get more grad LGBT students. Like, why are they not coming in? What do we do? And then are like, we have some extra funding. Why don't we just hire some grad students to actually help build space for grad students who are LGBTQ? But then also, then when someone walks in, you can be like, oh yeah, Kristen's a grad student, talk to Kristen, right? It allows for people to then like be seen in those spaces. And so I think just an easy, interesting process is as you go into these processes, think about how do we utilize representation? I said two, at least two, because then you don't want to be like, well, Christians are one gender nonconforming person, so we're done, right? Because that also just is that worse because it just tokenizes them, and actually helping them be a part of like, not just saying I'm hired you because you're genderqueer, but because you have all these skills and we think we want to make sure we are intentional about your voice and the community's voice in this conversation, to be able to make sure that the work that we do regularly is intentional, and we want you to ask the questions that help us shift the conversation. And so I think that's really important. And then also thinking about, workshops on campus and discussions. Like, would this be just a way to, even if you're like, I don't know where the genderqueer folks are on campus, we don't have an LGBT center, or if we do, then maybe we don't know how to partner with them. That's probably an easy way to partner, to say, can we put on a program on community and leadership for trans and gender nonconforming folks on campus? And that could be an open discussion, right? Just to even name who the community is. And then you at least get to have a conversation, say, what would be helpful for us? And how do you think of leadership? What are the ways that we can challenge leadership? And really having the vulnerability and the humility to say, we don't know, but we want to know and we want to be better. And so how do we engage in that work, I think is really important. And so I say y'all all the time. And I think that's just really important as a way to foster and to just create that space. I remember at UCLA, we wanted to create a space for South Asian, Desi, LGBTQ people, which was, there was a couple of students like, I know there's others. And I'm like, yeah, there are others. And I was like, I'm not gonna tell you because they have shared with me in confidence. But I was like, how about I give you $200 for like, you do a coffee hour to talk about Desi queer identities, right? And lo and behold, most of the folks that showed up were queer Desi people, which allows them. So really, like, I think putting your money where your mouth is, but also just like fostering those seeds and really building those seeds for allowing that to happen is really important. I see a couple of comments in here about being Southern. Yeah, I say y'all. I'm from New England and California, so I have no real connection to the South, but I think y'all is really important. And I think it's just fun to say.
Raja, did you see the question up above from Leslie about any recommendations we would
uh,
give for folks or departments that might be a little resistant to making these changes?
hmm, oh, sorry, I'm just reading the question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a conversation to really be able to say, why are we uncomfortable? I think the why and the how. I think that it all goes back to the why and the how for me. Is like actually having an honest conversation with your team, Leslie, of like, why does this make us uncomfortable? Like, what is it about the structure or the and if we as a community are committed to equity, I'm sure every campus has some diversity or inclusion, something in their pillars. It's like, how are we actually fostering inclusion if we are so uncomfortable with this? And what does it mean for us as a team? Is it because we're uncomfortable that we're going to screw up, which means we're going to, we feel like we're going to get canceled or whatever? Is it because we just don't know if that exists? Or is it because we don't know how to, like, often for me, I find that it's come from a fear of screwing up and feeling like then you're just going to be kind of blacklisted
Right.
for whatever experience. And so then that just means that we need to actually do some workshops, and we got to do some work on it and and for me, then I say, if we were similarly uncomfortable asking for race or asking for their class year, like, what does that mean? And so what data are we missing? And if we don't actually make space to actually engage in these conversations, how are we actually denying a whole group of students intentionally from leadership role that can actually be important and that can actually probably also reframe what we think of as leadership, which does require a culture shift. So that's also the conversation that I think, Leslie, you may need to have, is like there might be even a deeper foundational conversation, like, what is leadership for us? And are we, and how, and I think if we can get that, because I think the team would be open to talking about what is leadership, and then say, then how are we intentionally building an inclusion, not as a pillar of leadership, but actually leadership itself is inclusion. And so as the leadership office, are we actually modeling leadership in not being intentional about building spaces for gender nonconforming and trans folks and queer folks?
Great exercise to do with the people in your department, right? And what does inclusivity mean? And I think you it would be great to break down some of those barriers.
Yeah, and I think I see Betsy's piece around FOLX versus FOLKS. I don't personally, I don't have a feeling about. I think it's like FOLKS is not gendered as well, and so I know the intention about saying FOLX is to say like, oh, I'm being intentional, but I don't know if that actually does that in my experience, because I don't, it doesn't make me feel like, oh, that's more inclusive or less inclusive than folks, because folks itself is just, FOLKS is not gendered as a term, at least as I know. So unless if someone knows otherwise, please let me know. So I know often it's come from women being changed or from AN to XN to YN. And so it's an intentionality to like shift gender kind of norms. And I just don't know if the LKS versus X makes that big of a difference, because the folks itself is not a gendered term. So, and I don't know if I'm missing that. So if people have other insights, please share, because I'd love to learn.
Absolutely, absolutely.
All right, so this is some basic binary breaking systems, right? So thinking, identify gender inclusive restrooms. I'm sure many of your campuses hopefully have a gender inclusive restroom map where you can actually lay out, and when I know most of your LGBT centers often do it, but if not, maybe you can say, can we help you with this project, so that people can actually know where they are. I know when I was at a previous institution, we were in the process of actually creating an app where it would actually a layer, so that based on wherever you are, it could identify for you the closest 3 restrooms, so that people didn't have to worry about searching it out. Because I saw that some students would actually develop their whole academic schedule based on where they could go to the bathroom every day. And I was like, that, if we're trying to train the smartest people in the world and some of the best scholars, they can't be worried about freaking going to the bathroom. That just is a sad state of where we are as a world. And the fact that you can find a gender inclusive restroom where you're not going to feel like threatened or feel like you're going to experience harm. And so I think, so partially it's like, as a leadership office, working with various campus leaders, especially if there's LGBTQ folks, to say, how can we help push the need for more gender inclusive restroom, whether it's in our department, in our building, or on campus? Like, how do we utilize our political clout and access to do that, right? To increase more permanent gender inclusive restrooms. Or if you're going to do programs, let's say in the student union, to say, okay, and for every major speaker that we have, we're going to make sure that because there's 2 sets of restrooms, this set of restrooms are going to be gender inclusive. There's going to be a sign, there's going to be a definition of what it is and why it's important, and also directions for where the gendered restrooms are. So that, and then similarly at the gender restrooms, would let people know as a way to make sure that we are intentionally modeling what that looks like until we get comfortable to actually make permanent changes, right? And so whenever you do a retreat, make sure there's a gender inclusive restroom. I remember my last leadership, we were talking about this earlier, was at the University of Michigan. And, and they were really intentional, like, here's a gender inclusive restroom. That was part of the planning process, because they just knew that was, and for me as a gender inclusive, gender queer person, it was nice to not have to be the person like, and is there a restroom for me? So I don't feel like I'm having to choose all the time. And so I think just that making that a part of your checklist as leadership program creators, or like as you're, if you're giving funding to students, to say, as you're giving, as part of the funding, is that these are some of the steps that, I'm sure there's all these different stipulations. One is probably make sure the gender inclusive restroom is available, right? Or is named and identified. Here's the language. And so really naming that out. So it's not just like create whatever you want. And then also like changing our language. Like, why do we call it the women's restroom versus a restroom? Why not just say, here's the bathroom, here's the restroom?
Right.
Or, I remember working with the health center that was like, we have women's programs, which is really around gynecological care and body care. But it's like, why is it women? Like, we know that body parts and gender and sex are not necessarily all the same. So why are we still using outdated language? So like, if we think about Women's Leadership Institute, what does that mean? And what are we doing with that? And how are we intentionally binarizing the work? And are there ways, and both recognize that that's a really deep conversation that needs to happen, of like, what is the impact of this conversation? Who is the purpose of this conversation? Who are we intentionally leaving out? Is that helpful? Is that not helpful? And so that's just, it just needs to be, the intention needs to come in so that the impact is really what we want it to be, versus making us feel like some people are valued or not others. And there's not a perfect way to do it. The other thing is also just being comfortable making mistakes and be like, mea culpa, let's figure this shit out again.
Right.
And then I think for me, these are the questions that I ask all the time, is like, what is leadership? Like, how do we actually do, like, who gets to define leadership? And what are the normative and assumptive notions of leadership that we work with that are often based on, all these leadership theories are based on white cis men at Harvard, right? And so like in the 1950s. And so is that still relevant to our world today? Or can we actually maybe shift what is leadership to being masculine and feminine aspects of various traditions? And that across the world, if we really think about a global perspective, those values and perspectives and elements look really different. And why do we consider some skills leadership qualities and not others? And how are we being sexist and gender, transphobic and gender non-conforming and gender non-inclusive by using those qualities? And how does that then impact who we select for awards, right? And how do we actually define leadership, and what does that mean? And how do we assign cultural value to masculine and feminine expressions of leadership, and how does that impact recognition, and how does that impact kind of the unspoken and spoken values of leadership, which I think is all about genderedness and often masculinity and misogyny, and in being misogynistic, also being non-inclusive, gender non-conforming, genderqueer folks and trans folks. So I think I know I'm throwing a lot out and quite a few things to think about. I think some of the things that we need to be thinking about doing, I'm going to run through this really quickly, just really positive reinforcement of non-binary leadership, like identifying those folks, not being like, we're going to have a non-binary award for you, Kristen, but rather like as we think about leadership, being like, oh, hey, all the things that we're celebrating people for are XYZ, which are all like, it just happens that they're all 5 men. Like, what does that mean that that's how we value leadership? And who are we missing? Like, even just asking that question, being like, whose perspective is not at the table? And
Such
why?
a valuable question is whose perspective is not there and who's not represented. Going back to what you said earlier, right? Our gender nonconforming students are in our programs. We just might not see them. They might not see themselves in that space. So how are we looking at the processes in place to look at who's not here? Why are they not here? What's happening in that, especially as it relates to leadership?
And the reason I say whose perspective is not at the table is because I'm like, I can still choose to have a perspective of someone that isn't at the table. Versus if I just say who's not at the table, then I'm still putting a lot of the burden on those people to show up and do the work, right? And so for me, as a leadership educator, my job is to be intentional about that. And so if I say whose perspective, I can say I can learn other perspectives. I can't take on other identities. And so I think there's also just how do we shift that conversation? And then also thinking about disconnecting body activities from gender and thinking about when we say boys go over here, girls go over here, what are we doing and why is that important? And what does that actually mean for us? Or thinking about when we do housing for retreats, like, what are we doing when we say all the men, all the boys go into these cabins, all the girls go into that cabin, and then we'll have one honorary genderqueer cabin. Like, that's still like othering. It's still creating another sense of other. And what's the purpose of it? And it's both real because it's built in sexual violence. And so I want to also name that and impact on particular gendered bodies. And so if that's the purpose, but at least be willing to have the conversation, to be clear about why we're doing it. So if someone says, why are we doing this? You actually have an answer rather than like, because it's just the way we've already done it. And so really being clear about the intentions and then also being aware of what impact that might have, and then figure out mitigating factors to actually address those is important. And then we're going to screw up. And so like, if you misgender person, rather than be like, I'm so sorry, I'm a horrible person, blah, 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 or just saying, I do a Monday night meditation sangha, and someone misgendered me, and soon after said, "Oh, and sorry, Raja." Da, 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 da. And so and then just kind of, and so even that, I was like, I appreciate at least just repairing in that moment of like, just fix yourself, just like take, oh crap, and then follow up with a, hey, I'm so sorry I did that. I will work better to do that again, and actually do the work, and not just say I'm gonna then like like that was with my previous supervisor. I was like, literally kept misgendering me in the groups of like 300-400 people on campus. And I was like, that's actually devaluing my ability to actually do my work, because it's making me then feel inauthentic in my own experience because of this external misgendering, which then feel like that I have to correct you as as a woman of color in this political context. Like I'm also then like, that's not helping you and that's not helping me. And so how do we do that? And so, but would then say, I'm sorry, but then would do it again all over again. So I think that was part of the reason I left, was because I was like, I just feel like I'm having to fight this larger system that's just not helpful to me. Feel like I'm authentically showing up and being seen and valued as in who I am. And then really, I think one of the often leadership programs also includes Greek leadership programs. This is a much more complicated conversation to get through, but just thinking about, how do we foster conversation with the community and across the councils around gender identity and inclusion, around trans and non-binary folks, and what does that mean? And that's a whole nother, there's dissertations written about that, so you all can get there as well. So I think that's that. And then I think we have a couple of questions. So I guess we have about 15 minutes. We'll probably end about 2 or 3 minutes just before the hour. But what are some opportunities and barriers to cultivate more gender expansive understandings of leadership in our work? I don't know if folks have thoughts or ideas or questions.
If people want to respond there in the chat, if you've thought about that, and or maybe have had some opportunities that have, or barriers that you've encountered on your own campus in your own work, and want to share a little bit.
And I see quite a few other colleagues and leaders in this work on the list of participants as well. So please share insights. I know you all are more brilliant than I am, so please share away.
I think while they're typing, Raja, what's really resonated with me is our ability as leadership educators to also be advocates and for the work on campus and other areas, and give that agency then to the students that we work with, right? You mentioned it a couple of times, right? That you would put it in contracts of having gender inclusive restrooms, and then use that in other venues that you were on your own campus. And how do we give that agency also to the students to do that, and to use the power they have to do that?
Right. And I think for me, just coming from intersectionality as a framework, I'm always thinking about the individual interpersonal institutional level. It's like, what am I doing and what agency do I have as an individual to engage? So for me, that's like my email, my Zoom name, my business cards. Like literally, I went to my boss and I was like, I want to add my pronouns on my business card. She was like, okay. And I was like, I expected a fight. And I was like, no one had just thought about it. And I was like, and so then and then other people in the division started, even though it was like the LGBT center that started, like other people started doing it. I was like, okay, that's easy for us to do, similar to email. So it's like, there's ways to do that at an individual level, which then became an interpersonal, which then became an institutional impact, right? So our individual action can be a much bigger wave of change that we don't even understand. And I'm looking at the comments here. So I see Lucretia's comment about not including pronouns. And I think this is also where allyship is really important. So if you have not been able to build community or to feel like you're coming through with them, you may be thinking about, are there allies within the department that can maybe start to advocate for that? Or if there's other community members across campus. And I think for me, like for me, I loved working with when I was at the LGBT center because I was like, I could go in and say, as the LGBT queer for pay on campus, here's what I believe are strategies for you to be intentional about being inclusive. Then it was like an expert telling you this versus, a colleague that wanted. So using the power structures to your advantage is important. And also I can understand, I know very dearly, Lucretia, the struggle that comes with. Roman, let's see, think about how efforts over gender inclusion can still perpetuate binary biases of gender. For example, in my experience with a leadership retreat, I was paired with a cisgender woman and was told it was about gender equality, but invisible as my identity as a genderqueer person, especially when all other pairs were exactly. So it's still that, oh, let's have a man and woman. Oh, okay, and Roman. It's like, but like I don't fit that binary. And so what does it mean to do that? At least to name and say, we're being intentional about challenging the binary and not say, oh, it's because you both, it's the denial of our existence. And that is a deeply painful, and for me at least, a lot of my trauma and healing work is around feeling not enough and feeling like I have to do XYZ to be enough, and finally coming to a place where I feel comfortable showing up as I am. But even then, I have to recognize that that's always going to mean that people are going to misgender me because their framework is not shifted. And so, from it, thank you for just naming, like, in trying to be inclusive, we're still fitting into a binary, right? And what does that actually mean for us? Um,
I've had that experience at LeaderShape when I've paired facilitators together and didn't realize I was doing it. Like it was here, I thought that I just didn't even recognize it, right? And when it was brought to my attention, I was like, oh, absolutely. What? Yeah, I sure did make you feel like you don't matter, and I've assigned a gender to you that is not yours, right? And what does that mean? And how do we move past that?
Right. And I think now I'm thinking, I think I've only been partnered with other female identified folks. So that's also interesting. And not that it's an intentional, but I was
No,
like, oh, I'm like, I've never thought about that until Roman brought this up too. So like, I'm going to be more aware and intentional, like, okay, I'm going to maybe push back a little more.
absolutely,
But,
absolutely.
and that's also part of the relationship building, right? It's like having the trust say, hey, can you tell me about why this is? And actually helping people have that conversation.
Absolutely. And to think that, like, when we're in that conversation, the value that that conversation is and how we entered into that. And I remember that conversation very specifically. It wasn't an attacking conversation. It was just a, "Hey, have you noticed this? Like, because I noticed it, because this is my experience and I've noticed it. And it's been hurtful to me because I
Mhm.
don't think it lives up to the values that you all have as an organization. Can you tell me more about it? Like, what, and just the conversation itself, right? And thinking about how we continue to learn with each other.
Yeah, and I see Courtney's comment about, there are opportunities for us as you get to, like, often you get to create the curriculum if you're teaching a leadership class or whatever. And so trying to figure out what are the canonical things that you often go to and why, like, and really, I think that does require a departmental conversation to say, why do we do this? And I'm the kid, when I was a kid, like I would always ask why. So my parents would always get annoyed with me. They're like, oh my God, just because I told you. But I think for me, that's such an important part of the way I think about this work. It's like always being able to ask why, even if I'm feel like 100% certain or comfortable about why or what I'm doing, because that always allows me to say what perspective is not at the table, right? And allows us to be able to figure out, like, what are some other ideas and voices that we can add in that is going to complicate the conversation, and that might actually, and I think someone else had brought up, I think Dean had brought up this idea of professionalism and, well, what does it mean? Because I remember showing up, I was an assistant provost, and I showed up and I was in a bright red suit and I had some heels on and lipstick and a shaved head. And people were like, I literally got someone to say, oh, and it was never told directly to me, but it was told, we value professionalism in this organization, which was saying I look professional, but not in the way they want it because I didn't fit the binary. Right. And I was like, I look fucking professional as hell. It's just that it doesn't
Right.
mean, right. I look adorable, but it didn't meet what you needed in that moment. Right. And so really interesting. Um, I'm also just reading some of the comments here.
Sarah's mentioning how this has been a barrier in COVID. Encountering even more incorrect pronouns and incorrect names because of the online platforms not being able to be adapted and
Mhm.
personalized.
Which is, yeah, which is also strange, because I'm like, I wonder why we are in 2021 still not able to do this. I'm like, at least, like, most often people are able to kind of rename themselves unless the host has made it not possible. But
Right.
then also I think about all the different learning management systems that we use on our campus, whether it's Blackboard or Canva or whatever, and the ways that those, how do we add preferred pronouns or just pronouns in, one of the big things that I got to before I left UCLA was we actually created a process for pronouns to be added into the academic roster system so that every faculty member got a name, a legal name, preferred name, and a pronoun that folks could actually self-identify so that they didn't have to feel like they had to do it themselves. So like what, and it took us 4 years to do it. So I think that was definitely something to think about. How do we systemically make things inclusive? Okay. I see Christine's point as well about I often see the desire to be inclusive. So binary non-added women focused programs, but then that actually then takes away spaces for women. So we're again centering maleness and cis maleness in trying to be inclusive. So it's the othering, but even more structural othering, which is not helpful either. And I think, and there's probably some spaces where like a women's program that is a women's leadership, I'm not, that shouldn't exist, but to say, be intentional and clear about why you're doing it and be aware of how you're going to address if something comes up. If someone says, why am I not included as a gender non-conforming person? Like have that conversation so you're not flubbering as it happens. And that's also what I think creates a messiness, but also don't just create a leadership program and a women's program, because then still then saying like, leadership programs are not for women, right? Like you're also just by creating that, like there's normative language that we use all the time. And also how do we create multiple spaces? Rowan says, I just don't think a lot of people just don't understand why it's important if they don't share that experience. Is active, it's inertia. Yeah, exactly. People just don't feel like it just feels like, why is it so hard for, like, why do you make it so hard? Why can't you just use easy pronouns for me? I'm like, because my job is not to make your life fucking easy. Because like my job is hard enough in just existing in this world. All right. Other, let's see. Perfect. Folks in marginalized groups notice patterns. I love the why reflection. For me, it's more about helping people understand the importance of understanding why pronouns are important. Understanding students, colleagues change their behavior because that chose to, not because we tell them to. Right. Yeah. It's like they choose to do so. And so I remember when at UCLA, the dean of students, who was my supervisor, started putting pronouns in her email. And people were like, why are you doing this? And she was like, because I can, and I'm the dean for students for the whole university. Why shouldn't I? But there was a bit of interesting resistance, and then there's folks in the student contact office who struggle because they're like, if let's say we're dealing with some type of trans or gender nonconforming based violence or some issue where it's a harasser and a student who's harassed, how do I put the pronouns in my email, and does that feel like we're maybe have a particular pull or particular political perspective? I was like, both and, right? And like that means that you're being intentional about being inclusive. That doesn't mean you're going to necessarily side with one or the other, because we put our names on there, we put our other identities on there,
Right.
that often are not used. And often, white straight cis men never have to defend why they have to put their faces on there or whatever images, and how that it's never challenges. Marginalized communities are often challenged for showing up, right? And dominant communities are not. Yeah, exactly. In writing curriculum for undergrad peer facilitators to use, I write ask students or request that everyone write in chat as a way to model language for inclusivity. We also do explicit training about the importance of using pronouns that people use. Yeah, like I used to do a whole session for TAs and faculty on pronouns and gender inclusiveness, because I was like that, because they struggled. And for a lot of our grad students and TAs, this is uncomfortable for them. And so and a lot of these issues that could have been mitigated happened because they just had never learned about it, or especially if they're international students. And so like, how do we as a structural level think about, we as a community, what do we, what can we do? How do we do it? And why do we do it is really important. Yeah, I think, and Anna's point of like, people that use multiple pronouns, and what does that mean to erase folks when we just use one or the other? When in doubt, I always go to they, just because I'm like, I don't know, but even that feels like it's still because I don't know, and because it feels the most intentional, but other folks get really offended by it too. Often cis people get offended by it because they're like, oh, I'm not trans. I'm like, they is useful for everyone. It doesn't have to be for a trans. Like, it's not just creating. It's actually for me, it's the most inclusive way to identify our name. Or if someone says just use my name, just use their freaking name. Like, just do what. For me, it's the platinum rule. Like, treat people the way they want to be treated, not the way you want to be treated.
It's the value, right? It's the recognition of who they are and they are seen, right? And I think that that is so important. That's so important.
And my passive aggressive way, if people keep misgendering me, is to misname them. So if Kristen keeps I would just say, "Oh, Molly, right? Molly," and people are like, "No." I'm like, "Well, then you're doing the same to me. Like, why?" Like, so it's a playful passive aggressive space that I do only intentionally with some people, not everyone, but like it's a way to just help people understand the ridiculousness of misgendering is the same as misnaming.
Right. I like it. I like it. I like naming them. That's awesome. But think about it.
Now you're gonna be known as Molly,
I'm
Kristen.
gonna go Miss Molly. It's really great. But think about it, even young children, I have young children, and when I call them by the wrong name, they automatically they're like, "That's not my name." I'm like, "Right. That's exactly, exactly." We all want to be recognized for who we are, right? So, I think that's phenomenal. Well, Raja, I know it's like 2 minutes to the hour, and we wanted to wrap up a little early in case anybody wanted to stay on. There are a lot of questions that we didn't get to cover, and I'll invite everybody to take a snapshot of those questions so that you can do some exploration on your own or continue to think about as you engage in these conversations with colleagues, peers, family members, wherever you're having these conversations, which hopefully are in lots of environments, not just in our work environments, that you're beginning to think about what those mean. And so, grab a snapshot of that. And Raja, I just want to say thank you so much for spending the time together. The hour went so quickly. I could spend all afternoon with you, and we have up here, if you all want to talk more with Raja and find out more, and just to engage in this conversation and to continue learning. I know they'd be really eager to reach out with you all, and so their information is right there on the bottom of the screen. And Raja, are you going to put your social media stuff in the chat?
I can, yes.
Perfect. And we'll send it out as well afterwards in there.
Just gonna copy and paste quickly.
Perfect. Perfect. Well, I wouldn't be a leadership session if I just didn't let you all know, gosh, as you all navigate leadership development for students on your campus, if there's a way that we can partner with you to continue to engage in conversations like the ones we had here, or help individuals realize the potential they have to make a difference, that's what we're all about. So feel free to reach out to us, reach out to either myself or Vernon, just go to our website, leadershape.org, and we'd be happy to work with you as you all continue to navigate student affairs life in a pandemic world. What does that look like? We'd be happy to help. So with that, thank you all so much. Raja, again, thank
Thank
you.
you both. Yeah, thank you all for the conversation. I'm really excited to continue the conversation.
Great. Well, we'll hang out for a couple of minutes if anyone has other questions, but otherwise enjoy the rest of your Wednesdays, everyone. Bye.